So I first actually came across Bhante through his writing. My very first night visiting the Buddhist Centre in Glasgow, we heard a talk by Bhante which absolutely knocked me out. It was a talk called The Nucleus of a New Society, and it was one of 4 talks that Bhante had given the year before. And in this particular talk, he said something which completely knocked me out in a positive way, which was that we change ourselves so that we can change the world, and that the world changes to help you change yourself. Completely paraphrasing, it's not quite like that, but I was somebody who'd been looking for a way to change the world. So when I heard this, I thought it made complete sense, because I wasn't particularly interested in self-development, just in a way to become a nicer person, though that was quite a good thing that I became a nicer person. But I was just really sort of taken by what I heard in this talk. So I had lots of questions after I'd heard the talk, and there were a few order members in Glasgow at the time, all men, and one of them that lived there was Dhammarathi, who I had known a little bit previously, and he gave me a copy of the 3 Jewels to read, which there were only a couple of books at that point available. And I took it home and I'd read it in 3 days or something. And I wrote to Bhante with a whole list of questions that I'd read in this book. And Bhante responded, and he answered every question and went into quite a bit of depth. And he said at the end of it, if you're ever visiting Norfolk, do come and say hello, or something like that. And I wasn't even entirely sure where Norfolk was. So I thought, there's no way I'm ever going to go to Norfolk. But then later I did go specifically to get to know him, to visit him. And I didn't really have any sense of who Bhante was, or the fact that he was like the teacher or the founder. It was just somebody that'd written a book that I was really taken by, and I just thought to write to him. So I might not have if I'd known how everybody held him in such high esteem. But the guys, the order members in the centre in Glasgow were very encouraging. I said, I'm going to write to him. And they were like, yeah, go and write to him. So I did. I did go and visit him in the following April or something, because in the interim period my mother had died. And I'd written to Bhante and told him that. And again, he said, oh, do come and see me. So I went off up to stay. There was a women's community in Norfolk, not far from Padmaloka, and I went to visit him in Padmaloka. We just talked for hours. I mean, I think it was literally about 2 hours. I thought he seemed a bit eccentric, very English. But he was very kind, because one of the things I was talking to him about was the fact that I'd had so much. I was 25 at the time, but I'd had a lot of death already in my life, and we talked a lot about that. And I just found him very kind and very interested. And also he was curious, you know, he wanted to know things like what had I studied, what did I read, things like that. So it just felt very, very easy to communicate with Bhante. And I realised later that that's not everybody's experience, but I think I didn't know enough about him to project too much. So I think I just took Bhante at face value, that like there was an immediacy to our communication. And I wrote to him a lot. I used to write to him every couple of weeks, or which must have been very boring really for him, because I'd give him great detail about everything that I was doing. And then I moved down to live in London that summer, but yeah, July 78. And so I would see him around then and go and visit him, and it sort of built up quite a strong friendship, really. I'd go out sometimes with him to help him buy presents for his mum and his sister. Things like that, yeah. So Bhante invited me to join him on a tour of our centres in the USA in 1993. And I think we spent 2 months, 7 weeks, 8 weeks or something like that. So I saw Bhante every day for a couple of months. And a number of things really stood out for me. One of them was the evenness of his energy. On the travel over, we were stuck in Dulles Airport for 18 hours because of storms in Boston, which is where we were flying to. And I mean, 18 hours is a long time to sit around, and there was him and somebody else who was travelling with us and myself. Banty just chatted and was wide awake, and kind of just his energy was just incredibly calm and quite playful. The three of us chatted lots, and I remember I went off to buy a book, and I came back and it was the genre was lesbian detective fiction. I can't remember what the book was, and he said he thought this was very amusing, and he teased me a lot about buying a book where probably all the bad people were men and all the good people were probably lesbians. And I kind of fell for it, and I was saying, no, it's not quite like that. It's found myself defending something, and then realising he was just winding me up. So he was very good at kind of teasing people. But that whole trip, I mean, I saw him, as I say, I think every day virtually. We were in retreats where he did question and answer sessions. He did a lot of poetry readings. I'm laughing at that because I was never a big fan of Banty's poems, and he knew that. So he used to tease me in the car, oh, I'm going to do another poetry reading. But anyway, just over 2 months, I don't think I ever saw a fluctuation in Banty's kind of mental states, from as far as I could see anyway. Just very calm, very playful, and very inspiring. Very kind of, yeah, he gave a similar talk on a number of occasions because he launched the drama of Cosmic Enlightenment on that tour, and he talked about the rain cloud, about the Dharma as a rain cloud, which is a lovely image, and it was just incredibly inspiring. So I felt very privileged to have that couple of months. Yeah, and you know, at times we'd have, like, say, waiting in an airport or going through the airport, and people can get quite narky if they're tired, quite grumpy. And he really wasn't. He was very kind, very kind of polite to everybody, you know, all the kind of staff that tell you to take your shoes off or whatever. He just kind of was incredibly kind. It was quite a lesson for me in just seeing how somebody could just deal with everybody and everything in the same way. So it obviously came from a very deep inner kind of resource, and not thrown around by the worldly winds in the way maybe some of the rest of us were. As well as being very equanimous, very kind, which are things that I've mentioned, I think Banty also had quite a strong, what we might call Vajric sense in that term. So Vajric in the sense of, like, his energy could also be very full on and very focused. And a very strong memory I have of that was in 2009. I'd been a public preceptor for 5 years. Then I entered the college in 2004. There was 12 of us came into the college together. Anyway, 2009, there was the paper, What is the Western Buddhist Order?, which was going to be coming out. And we got a message to college members that Banty wanted to talk to us, wanted us to come to Majjhimaloka. So all of us who could just go, or some people were in retreat or whatever, but we all came to Majjhimaloka, and we got a preview of the paper of What is the Western Buddhist Order. And we did question and answer sessions, Banty, over, I can't remember, maybe 3 days or something. And at the time, there were things within it that were quite challenging. But the particular little vignette that I wanted to share was on the last day that we had a Q&A. Like, he was, in his 80s by then, I would think. He's certainly elderly. His sight was failing. He had his walking stick, and he was sitting in this room in a big circle in Majjhimaloka, kind of with his hands on his walking stick. And he needed a haircut, and he had his cardigan was buttoned up wrong. So he looked quite shambly, like this kind of old man just sitting there. And we'd had the question and answer, and then we'd finished the session, and Damarati, who was chair of the college at the time, said, Well, before you go, Banty, is there anything you would like to say to us as public preceptors? And he'd been kind of looking down, and he suddenly just raised his head and he said, yes, you may consider this the refounding of the order. And everybody just kind of sat back. And I think for me, it was this juxtaposition between what you'd look at and see, and then just what came. And it wasn't just the words that he said, but there was such a strength of conviction behind it. And as I say, what to me felt like Vajric energy. So not angry energy, but absolutely determined that we get this message. But then he got up and he needed help to get out of the room. So Mahamati took his arm and he had his carpet slippers on and he shuffled out of the room. And I think, even talking about it now, I can still get a bit of a frisson of remembering what that felt like. Because I felt like I was seeing the frailty of this elderly person whose health wasn't good, whose sight was failing, and at the same time, this spiritual presence that just came through and completely overtook that. And many years later, I spoke to Banty and I said I'd felt like it was a transmission. And he said, yeah, in a way it was a transmission. He really wanted to convey something of great importance. And there's a lot more around the paper that was of interest, but just that little vignette of a memory of this frail elderly gentleman and this extraordinary energy coming through. So that's one of my strongest memories of Banty. So yeah, the final kind of memory chronologically takes us up to 2018 and Banty's death, which is just a week or so ago was the anniversary, so it's kind of been in my mind as well. So I was still living here at Adhisthana at the time, and I was very involved with the funeral arrangements. Mahamati and Paramartha and I had been the consistent members of a kind of funeral committee that were looking at the planning for Banty's funeral, which he'd made very clear himself what he wanted. In fact, this is a little aside, but it also shows a certain aspect of Banty. We realised when we were sitting, the three of us talking about it, that it had been 18 years since Banty had asked us to take this on. So he was very good at forward planning and kind of thinking ahead and really thinking about what would be, not just what would be good for him, but like what would be the best thing for the order and the movement, which was why when we were purchasing Adhisthana, he wanted us to find somewhere where he could be buried, because he could see that that would, in the future, even hundreds of years in the future perhaps, would be a place of pilgrimage. So anyway, forward planning was definitely a characteristic. But what I wanted to share was, between the death and the actual funeral, Banty's body was laid out in one of the smaller shrine rooms at Adhisthana. And his body was lying in state, and behind him on the wall was the great big refuge tree painting of Chintamani's. And we were allowed to come in. When I say allowed, it was because technically we could only be in a certain number of people because of the temperature. So in one of the sessions, there were about 10 people sitting around Banty's body, and I happened to be sitting at his feet. And so I was looking at the body and then up at this refuge tree painting, and there's a depiction on the refuge tree of Banty about to ordain somebody. He's got a kesa in his hand, which is what's put around somebody's neck when they're ordained. And to his side, there's a little initiation vase. And I suddenly realised that to my left-hand side was Damadina, who's my Kalyana Mitra, and who'd been involved with me. I feel a bit emotional again. Who'd been involved with my practice since I was a Mitra, so for 30 odd years at that time. And on the other side, on my right-hand side, was Pasadadeepa, who I had ordained. And I suddenly saw lineage. I just suddenly, not just in a kind of mental, cerebral way, because I knew about lineage. That was one of the things we've talked about in the college, and it's important to me. But I just suddenly saw a depiction of the Buddha, who's dead, but is still very alive with us. A painting of Bhante, his dead body, and yet somehow in that room I could see the past and the future. And I knew that, well, to the extent you can know anything about the future, that actually would be okay. And that Bhante, in preparing us for his death, had given us all the tools that we needed to make sure that Sri Ratna stayed alive and thriving after his death. So that's my last memory.